I've been so frustrated by how slow everything is in JavaScript. Nothing should be out of scope if it means that something is slowing a tool down.
Thank you so much for taking the time to stop by. Sorry for waking you up so aggressively.
Yeah, I just need to have a more reasonable sleep schedule.
Don't we all? Anyways, fantastic to have you on. Thank you again. As I'm sure you've seen, Bun is blowing up, and it's been really awesome to watch your journey for the last, what? I think Kip introduced us a year ago now at this point.
Yeah, I think that's right.
For a bit of context for everybody else, from one of my old hacker friend groups, I had some homies that happened to be friends with Jared. And since they knew I was really into web tech, they were like, hey, have you heard about this Bun thing that Jared's working on? I had vaguely heard of it, but didn't have too much more detail, and quickly got very excited about what you're working on. But less about me and how I found Bun. I want to hear all about you and how you started it. So to get started, I'd love to hear, how'd you get into web dev, and how did that end up with you working on Bun?
The first programming language I learned was, I think it was Ruby. Yes, it was Ruby. I was building in high school, and I really hated school. And I tried a bunch of things. I tried to learn Django. I tried to learn PHP, but I ended up choosing Ruby on Rails because the docs were the easiest. That's a thing that kind of stuck with me. And it certainly doesn't look like that right now. Bun doesn't have real docs yet. It just has really long README. This is going to be fixed really soon. I think a lot of people choose what tools they use based on whichever one has the easiest docs, regardless of whether it's technically better or not. Obviously, I think Bun is technically fantastic, but the docs are so important, and it's this very clear thing that Bun isn't doing a good job of yet. Anyway, so I chose Rails because of the docs, basically, because the demo app that you create from the docs actually worked. I could get it working without getting stuck. And that's such a huge rush. I still remember the first time. This was a while ago now. This was probably 2012. Yeah. So 10 years ago. Wow. I was in high school doing that, and I learning that. I built this turn-in box. I asked a few of my teachers if they'd be interested in trying an online turn-in box for their classes, and they agreed because they saw how hard I was working on it. And then I realized that what if I could just not go to school, or what if I could just get a job now instead of going to school for the next 6 years or whatever, because I was a sophomore. Then I ended up getting an internship at a startup, just randomly emailed because I thought they sounded cool. So that's how I got into web dev.
Sounds like you were heavy on the project-based learning stuff, where as soon as you found the tech and were playing with it, you're like, I want to go make a thing with this. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm still pretty bad at learning by just reading a bunch of stuff. I have to learn by actually doing things.
That's one of the big things I preach here. I don't make tutorial content. I tell people what tech I'd use to build something, but I'm never going to sit here and say, here are the steps to pick a project, see it through, and get your first job. I think that the thing that I love about engineering is making cool shit happen that might not have happened otherwise. And that's the piece that pushes me through the hard parts, because building and writing code and doing all this shit, in a lot of ways it sucks. But if you have something you care enough about, that will push you through it.
I remember, especially early on, the motivation thing was the hardest part, because I remember this very clearly. It's so easy to get demoralized if you're stuck on something and you don't even know what the right words to Google are. That, I feel that's the hardest part when you're first starting out as a programmer, is what do I even Google? And then it's also how do I read the error messages? I feel one of the things that working on Bun really taught me a lot is how to read error messages. Because the specific language, the phrasing, word choice that error messages use are often words that you see a lot more in compilers. So the word token, for example. People don't really use token outside of things that are about lexing or parsing, but that comes up a lot in the error messages. I think I also think that's a bad thing, because it's in a way it's almost like academia, how this is a less extreme version of it, but how in papers they'll use very industry specific jargon, and it makes sense in context, but if you're not super familiar with it, it becomes harder to read, which is a trade-off.
To motivation for a bit though, because I think there's a really interesting piece there, how you said that you struggled with motivation when you didn't have projects to work on, but now you're one of the stereotypical most motivated engineers. What did you say, 90 hours a week? I'm curious what specifically made you flip and how you ended up getting to that much more motivated point.
It's really clear that a lot of people want Bun. And I think that, but even before that, the Bun is something that I have wanted myself for years and years. I've been so frustrated by how slow everything is in JavaScript. And I think, or rather, I know that JavaScript can get a lot faster. And the reason why is because I remember the first time I wrote like native code, it was, I think it was like Objective-C. And you write stuff to using nslog that's like the equivalent of console.log is like nslog. It's so much faster than console.log. I didn't realize that you could write to like the terminal that fast. And I think that it's true of a lot of how we use a lot of the APIs exposed to JavaScript. Just like all of it can get so much faster if we just had like a tool that did more stuff, that did more of all of this in one.
That makes a ton of sense. I'm curious how you got to, first off, like playing with that native stuff where you noticed how much better the performance was and how you specifically got to Zig.
Yeah, there's a bit of time between that. The playing with the native stuff was at my first job or so, and then Bun was more recently. But how I got to Zig was like, so I initially tried before building, let's see, when I was building Bun, when I was first thinking about building Bun, I was thinking about what language should I write it in. And I wanted to try, I had tried a little bit of Rust before, but it was just really hard for me to be productive in it. So Rust would have been like the obvious choice, I would say. But it's important to just choose a language that you can be productive in because you're going to be using it a lot. And that's not a general statement about Rust, really. It could just be me.
But it sounds like you had chosen to build a native solution before you had chosen the language. Had you played with Zig at that point? Or was it like, I don't feel productive in Rust, what other options do I have?
I've been thinking about Zig for a long time. If you go on my GitHub, you'll find one of the things you'll see is a project at build. And the idea was that like you could write these macros that executed JavaScript through a sort of templating language that would generate JavaScript. And I used this, so I was building this game. It was like a voxel, multiplayer voxel Minecraft-y game in the browser. Focused on like very large worlds where you could walk around and talk to people with like voice chat. And like I had like, at one point I even had live streaming in the game working. Like you could broadcast to Twitch from while being like a character walking around in the game with like video as well, like and audio. And I was just, the game got to be like a decently sized code base. And I was just really frustrated with, it just like the iteration cycle time got really slow. Every time I would save a change, it would take several seconds before I could actually test if the change worked. And when you're building a game, you really need like a fast feedback loop because a lot of stuff is just like, how does it feel to use it? And if you have to wait a few seconds between each change to know how a small thing feels, you might forget. You might stop and read Hacker News for a second, just out of like instinct because you're just waiting. And I really wanted that to never be a problem. It just seemed really stupid.
I've always found it funny that game dev tended to have the worst like HMR type solutions. I remember a story for the building of Destiny and Destiny 2 where the engine was at a point where when they made a change to the world, any of the modeling for the world files, they would have to wait 20 or so hours for their server farm to render up a new playable version.
That's terrible.
Yeah, so you move a rock like 1 foot to the side, 20 hours later, now you can actually play it and see if that was in the right spot for the weird platforming challenge you made. And that's a huge part of why the worlds in Destiny are so detailed, but not fun to be in because they couldn't work out those details, that polish, that fun layer, when you don't have the ability to interact with the things in your environments that you're building. And I think that's why to this day, most apps, even like the worst apps, feel more polished than some of the best games, simply because you have that iteration loop.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I started building it as like with really a focus on development, on the development iteration cycle. And at first I was like, okay, I'm going to just use ESBuild. And because it was a NextJS app, the game was like wrapped in the shell part was like a NextJS app. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to get ESBuild to work with NextJS apps. And so and actually even, this is like in a private GitHub repo and I got it to like work using a bunch of plugins in Go. But what I quickly found was that it didn't fix the iteration cycle time problem because ESBuild is designed more so for bundling your entire app at once. And even with the incremental mode, basically the incremental mode wasn't actually faster than the Webpack incremental mode for those builds. Like obviously like cold start and those things were faster, but not the incremental. So that was, and then I was also thinking about it more. And at this point I was like, what if I just build a bundler myself? And what if I just build a transpiler? And that's really all I was thinking about at this point. I was not thinking about a JavaScript runtime, just transpiler and bundler. So then I looked at what I thought about it, and I had seen, going back to that at build thing with the templating, what made me think about at build GitHub repo was because I was reading Zig's docs. It was on like Hacker News at some point, and I saw the part about comptime, and I was like, wow, that is really cool. I wish something like that existed for JavaScript. So it's like I had Zig in the back of my head, but I hadn't actually tried it. Then I was like, so then I tried Bun with actually a few languages before Zig, before concluding that Zig was like obviously the best fit. And in Bun's case, so basically the way I chose Zig was I just tried it and realized that like comptime would be an incredibly powerful tool for writing fast code. I'll give you I didn't actually explain what comptime is. Comptime in Zig lets you write arbitrary code at compile time. Most of the time, if you have some sort of, a lot of languages will have like macros. They'll have things that are based around text substitution, like adding a bunch of strings together to match what the language expects. But comptime lets you actually just execute arbitrary code. So like a small example of how this is used in Bun is one of the kind of random experiments a while ago was like, so one of the slowest parts of parsing for Bun is the lexer, just iterating through the text. And part of that is because you have to check if everything is an identifier or not. If the current token is a valid identifier, or whether it's a keyword or whatnot. And I needed a fast way to do that. So Bun uses a bit set that's generated at compile time of all of the Unicode like all the code points that it could be an ID start or an ID continue. Basically, it could be either the first letter or somewhere in the middle of the identifier. And that was like if I remember correctly, it was like a 2% performance boost. And then this bit set is like this, it's a 170 kilobyte bit set. It's huge for a bit set. But this is just generated at compile time. And sure, you could do that through various through the hacky build script or in another language. That's how you would approach it, probably. But in Zig, it's just a function. I have some caching thing for it in Bun's case, but usually, and there's a lot of that. There's another one where in the source maps parser for encoding VLQ, which is like the format that source maps use for like storing the numbers, it's not the format, it's an encoding. That also is just like a comptime function. These types of things are like normally you would just like copy paste a bunch of numbers that when you look at it doesn't really make any sense because they're generated by some tool and it requires a lot of context to understand. But when you have the function in the code itself, it's much clearer. What does this actually mean? It's much more maintainable that way. So yeah, comptime is really cool. And so that's a lot of why I chose Zig, because it's very fast and because you have comptime.
Really interesting. I think that there was a bit of a conception that you picked Zig because at least I wouldn't even say it's a conception so much as like the narrative is Zig is this new magical language that's way faster than Rust, and Jared's the one out here proving it, when it sounds more like there were specific features within Zig that made sense for what you were building in Bun. Is that more the case?
I do think Zig is designed to enable writing really fast software, and I think comptime is a big part of that. I think it's not something I don't know of. I'm sure I don't really know. I haven't seen other languages do that yet. I'm sure it exists, but yeah. I think that Zig is. It's also like this. The other part is that Zig is also very good at because comptime is the focus. There's all these other things that are really good too, like dead code elimination in the binary. Like a simple hello world Rust program, I think is something like 300 lines of assembly or something if you don't link libc, and like in a lot of and like C, that's a lot. C is, or I think like Rust is like 20 kilobytes or something like that. I'm not 100% sure that's true.
That's huge.
But it's like I'm not sure. That number could be wrong. But I'm going off of what people said in Bun's Discord when they were trying Zig as like in Hello World.
Interesting. I think that it's when I think about languages Golang and I compare them to languages like Zig, it feels like the focus of Zig is in a different place and in a different way, where a language like Go is more focused on the runtime of the language, like the routines, the methods of handling like its model of concurrency, the garbage collection, all those types of things. It almost feels like Zig is doing what like Svelte's doing, where it's trying very specifically to be a compiler to the language being like C, but by writing these hooks on a higher level to let you modify that process. It's a minimal adaptable compiler rather than a maximal thought out runtime. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Zig doesn't quite compile to C. It compiles to LLVM IR, which is also what in when you use LLVM, that's also what C compiles to. But it works really well with C. But yes, it is. It's definitely less focused on like the runtime part, which is really good for performance because there's so much hidden stuff going on that it's really hard to figure out. Like with a lot of the C+ code in Bun, which are mostly for the JavaScript core bindings. The way I find out I reuse most of the patterns from WebKit directly for this stuff, and the way I find out how it works a lot of the time is I just pause on the debugger and I just see what it's actually doing. But because there's so many layers of interaction between what code you run, what looks like a simple function call, and what actually is happening. And this is not a thing in Zig, not nearly as much because Zig doesn't support RAII. Actually, I don't remember what that acronym stands for, but basically, it's a way to. A lot of languages have a way to run code that runs at the beginning of a scope and then runs at the end of a scope, and that's very commonly a source of hidden behavior, or rather, hidden control flow, where you don't really know what's actually happening because the way the code reads is actually totally different than the way the code runs.
Someone in chat mentioned its resource acquisition is initialization. That sound correct? Yep.
Yes, that. Yeah, so initially for Bun, the way I was thinking about Bun at the very beginning was not actually, let's build like a really fast Bun learner transpiler, and then I was also thinking a lot about WebAssembly at first, and this kind of changed a little bit later, but I was thinking like, what if you could run the entire bundler and transpiler in the browser and just do that as like a dev server that exists entirely in your browser and not as a separate tool you download. And I tried that, and it's using like the file system access API, but it was just like, it wasn't a very good developer experience because it was mostly permissioning issues, and it was also it was hard to use it was also using a service worker, and you can't really rely on a service worker to always exist. So the pages would just like 404 that even if you try to do like server side, if you try to do like routing that way. I'm sure this will get better, but so I built like this whole like an early prototype of Bun's transpiler and bundler for that. And then when I tested it in the CLI, the non-WebAssembly version, initially it was slower than ES build. And then I changed around like the memory allocator used in Bun, and then it was 3 times faster than ES build at building the same files. And I was like, wow, maybe I should just focus on the CLI. So that's what I ended up focusing on.
This is really interesting because it feels like you went from, if I'm following this journey correctly, you went from focused on building a game in NextJS and having slow like response times from when you saved a code file to the change in the browser, to building browser dev tools to improve that DX and speed things up, to building a CLI to make it easier to compile and build in dev a work experience that is faster when you make changes. And now we're getting into how that pivoted into writing a runtime. But we're still, if I'm understanding, in dev experience land, where this is purely focused on when I'm developing a web app, making that process faster. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Cool.
Yes.
When did you realize you needed to make a runtime?
If you're using NextJS, you really do need to have some kind of server-side rendering part to it. It's hard to actually use it without that. You can, but it's pretty hard. And I really just wanted to make that work, but I knew that if I was going to embed Node, I would be a little frustrated with the startup time of that whole part. And so I initially with this, that goes back to that like ES build Go prototype. And so I actually, for that, I set up like a V8 isolate, which is like the lower level primitive used to embed JavaScript using V8 into this Go app. And I got that to like kind of work, but I didn't really think Go was a good fit because you have two garbage collectors. You have the Go garbage collector, and then you have the JavaScript garbage collector. And also there's other questions of C-Go performance and a few things like that. Okay, Go is probably not a great fit for this, even though like Go's tooling is great. Like the editor tools are so good.
We should go on a rant about editor tools for Zig after, but
I lost my train of thought.
So you were playing with Go as a potential runtime.
Yes. Yeah. And so server-side rendering. So yeah. So Bun needs. So these were like good experiments, but around this time I decided, okay, I should rewrite it in Zig. And I'd never written a line in Zig before Bun. I just started writing it, and I was like, okay, this is great. And I was really excited about how small the binaries were, and about comptime, and how I could actually figure out what's going on in the code pretty clearly, even though I didn't actually have much context on the language. And also just people were really helpful in the Discord. This kind of goes back to in Zig's Discord. This kind of goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning about Ruby on Rails, about how like the docs actually worked. I think you need either, in Zig's case, it was like the Discord, the people in the Discord were really helpful. So that I would have been really hard to make as much progress in Bun or get as far as I have now without the help of all those people. I lost my train of thought. So
it was about the Golang runtime for SSR and how you started using Zig, and clearly that was like the better language for it. At what point did you start actually writing a runtime in Zig, and what was the like planned scope? Was it always just, I want to make it so I can run my NextJS dev app faster? At what point did it become more than that?
Yeah, so you can see an artifact of that right now with the way Bun works with Bun dev, how you can't actually start a JavaScript file from Bun dev. You have to have the framework set up, which today is pretty much just Next, but it can be others in the future. And that's an artifact of how Bun was first a bundler and transpiler and not a runtime, which I'm changing now. Bun dev will probably become a runtime API instead of this default setup right now. Like this will probably be flipped. But how it got to the actual focus on the runtime was I experimented with a bunch of different possible runtimes. I looked at using V8. I looked at using JavaScript Core, and just JavaScript Core starts up really fast. And there's a lot of benchmarks where JavaScript Core is just faster at things like, especially things like regex. And I think the other really interesting thing about JavaScript Core specifically is that WebKit, as the name implies, is an entire toolkit for building web browsers. And WebKit is structured as a code base as there's WebKit, there's Web Core, there's like a standard library, and then there's JavaScript Core. And there's a few other things too in there. But the interesting part is that it's relatively straightforward to use parts of sorry, I'll go more context. WebKit is Safari's is the browser engine that Safari uses. It's like the open source version. And there are other users of WebKit as well. There's PlayStation using it. I think there's a refrigerator company using it.
Didn't a lot of Google's runtime originally start from WebKit and get forked, like, admittedly a while back, but...
Yeah, really more specifically Blink. And then if you go back far enough in the WebKit commits, you'll see when you could either choose V8 or JavaScript Core to use as the JavaScript runtime. And then later once Blink became a separate repo, that went away. So the really neat thing about JavaScript Core, in addition to the performance and all of that, is that because WebKit is like this piece of all-in-one browser building toolkit, you can actually Bun actually pulls in stuff from Safari effectively. So like the headers object, the URL object, and a number of other ones like event are actually directly from Safari. And I think it feels almost like a cheat code for a JavaScript runtime on the server, because instead of having to implement all of the web standards like these from scratch, we can just use the one directly that is used by a browser. And that comes with like their test coverage and and also just like the performance of like Safari's performance is very good.
That is really interesting. Have there been other attempts to use JavaScript core as a backend runtime, or was this like the first that you know of?
There definitely are a few attempts if you look on GitHub. In fact, there was at one point a Node, somebody tried to make like a Node JavaScript or a Node JSC build. But I think that a big part of Bun is not just the runtime, but it's also that it is a bundler and a transpiler, and as well as a package manager. And I think that when you put everything in one tool, the rest of writing code gets so much simpler because it's this, you have to make all of these small decisions that, like JavaScript is assembly required today. You have to to actually build something, you have to put a bunch of tools together to make it work, but none of the tools were explicitly designed to work together. So it's just like a lot of stuff you have to think about. But everything was designed to work together. You don't have to think about as much stuff. And you can make it much faster.
Wasn't that Rome's plan?
I don't know. I don't work on Chrome.
I know. It's just, I have to joke about Rome because that project's been painful to watch from the outside. The promise of solving all the problems by starting from scratch and then never delivering anything.
Shipping is really hard.
Yeah.
I just picked a really arbitrary time to ship. That's why there's so many bugs right now. Because I was looking at this and I was just thinking, yeah, it's been over a year. If I don't ship soon, people are just going to think this is just like never going to happen.
Yeah, it's so important to pick a date and ship. I think that people miss that part. I'm not the biggest Justin Kahn fan, but one of my favorite Justin quotes was, if you're not ashamed of your V1, then you shipped it too late.
Yeah, I am very ashamed of Bun right now. It shouldn't have all these bugs. But I'm also very proud of it too, because it's a very good start.
It's a phenomenal start. And I can tell by just the numbers of people, like literally 180 something people were waiting on YouTube for you to show up for a bit. There was it had a countdown for me. I went live because I felt bad having so many people sitting waiting and just chatted with them for then. But there is so much hype around what you're building here. And clearly that's because you're touching on a need that a lot of people have had. So I'm so fascinated by the journey from like NextJS user-facing game dev to scope creeping all the way to like building everything you need to improve the DX as a developer. But when I look at it now,
does sound kind of random.
Sorry.
It does sound random when you put it that way.
It is, but that's so cool. I didn't know any of this, and I'd imagine that not a lot of others did before. It's so cool that it makes sense now when I look at it and I see the one framework binding for Next that's like half-baked and doesn't do the server stuff that I'm excited about. It makes so much sense when I realize how you started and what your focus was and how that got you to where you are now with it. And I'm curious, was there ever a point where you're like, this scope has creeped too far, let's prune it back a bit? Or did you just say fuck it and go all the way from Next.js runtime, or Next.js like DX to SQLite?
Yeah, that is a big difference. I think that basically, I don't know what the philosophy is, but essentially I really think that the tools we use can just get a lot faster. And I think that, I think that Bun, and I have this philosophy that like, I don't like the idea of something like not being my job, but I think that like a lot of performance is if you have to, nothing should be out of scope if it means that something is slowing a tool down. So if the bottleneck in Bun is like the SQLite client is slow or whatever, then Bun should build a faster SQLite client. And I think like the longer term, like Bun obviously can't have literally everything ever in the built in, but this is part of why Bun has Bun FFI. But Bun FFI is a really fast way to make native code accessible from JavaScript. So you could like call functions using native libraries. It's much faster than like Nappy or other existing tools for JavaScript. And it's also really simple because there's no actual API on the native side of things. You can just call functions. It also means that you could have like more, because of that, in theory, this isn't really a thing yet, but it could be with just a little bit more tooling. You could have the same Bun FFI libraries that work in WebAssembly too. The longer term of that, which I think would be really cool, is what if you could just import C files or import Rust libraries in JavaScript and have those libraries not actually expose, like you do import from, and then you pass it a file name. Maybe in the future those file names could be like Rust files or Zig or other native languages in the import specifier, and then you make it work with WASM.
Interesting. So you do see a future where we could run Bun in the browser.
That would actually be that would just be a transpiler level thing. So the code it would output, it wouldn't be running Bun exactly. I think there's some version of that does need to eventually exist. Like I really want Bun to work on like StatBlitz, for example. But I think it wouldn't be running that specific way. Would just be the transpiled code, the bundled code eventually would do the things to make that work rather than being a runtime level operation. Like you wouldn't want to ship a web browser, or to a web browser, you wouldn't want to ship a whole JavaScript runtime on top of that. You would want to just ship the bundle that you're using.
Makes sense. Really important question, quick. The Bun runtime is officially called the Buntime, right?
No.
Come on.
I just kind of need a name I need some way to distinguish when I talk about Bun the runtime versus Bun the rest of Bun. I've been saying Bun.js, but I don't really like that because it sounds very like early 2000s. Like I didn't.
Buntime. It's sitting there.
I feel like it should have something that explicitly says JavaScript in it, or like hints at it being about JavaScript, because I don't know though. In general, I like puns though.
Puns are great. And it's such a friendly name for puns, especially since Kip's bunny was actually named Bundle. It's just perfect.
Yeah. Though I guess it's a little confusing since now the logo is a bow. So yeah, it's also, to be clear, it's not an onion. A few people have asked, is it an onion? No, it's a bow. So I would rather have it been a bunny, but I didn't have the cute bunny. So since there's a cute bow.
I do like the steam bun. It's cute.
Yeah.
There's so much here, and it's just like the journey of Bun is so fascinating. And I feel like we've talked a lot about like your focus, which is clearly performance and pain points as a developer, as well as the bugs that switching to Bun has and causes at the time. I'm curious what you think is next for Bun, not necessarily in what you're going to do to it, but how it will scale and be used. What are the production Bun use cases you have seen, expect to see, and are excited about?
I'm really excited about the performance of server-side rendering. I think that's going to be like when server-side, and what I especially think is that the way the Bun's integration with having a built-in transpiler API, Bun has a built-in transpiler API. It's still very early. The next step for that is to actually have a built-in bundler API, and then and this is not well documented yet. You won't find nearly enough about this written in the README or anything. But so Bun already has macros today. It uses a custom JSX transform when you're running these macros, and these macros let you return arbitrary JavaScript objects that get inlined into the AST. Basically, you can think of them as something like Babel macros, except instead of from the JavaScript side, you can use it without special APIs. So you're not creating. It's not. You don't need. You can use the JSX version of it, but you can also just return it like a regular array or regular object, and it'll inline the data into the build, and you can pass context data to the macros. So say you're like in an HTTP request, you're serving up some code. You could transpile the code in the HTTP request, and maybe for example, you could have database calls that just run as part of the build step in the transpiler and embed the SQL query results or whatever into the actual file. And so that would be like a much simpler way to, when the data is like mostly static, that's a much simpler way than embedding a client side, than using something like GraphQL. Or you could even use GraphQL to do that.
It's almost like you're doing ISR at such a high level that you're competing with Remix.
I wouldn't say I'm competing with any, like Bun is
That's
competing
fair.
with any framework. It's not, because I think I want all of these frameworks to use Bun. And they could use these tools themselves. But I do think that the idea is that in the actual interface for using these is you import a function and it's just a function call. It just happens to be that function happens at build time instead of at runtime. And then after you call it, the import statement at the top is removed. So it's like a much simpler way to run code at compile time. And it's very much inspired by Zig.
That is really cool. One of the like use cases I was thinking of comes about from the SQLite bindings and the crazy times I was seeing there. I am seeing an opportunity more and more to build like a distributed data API where something like the whatever the I forgot the name of the like crazy distributed SQLite solution that Fly.io just bought. But if you were to combine that with edge containers or honestly like regional containers of any form, using Bun as the JavaScript runtime to fetch from those SQLite DBs and return a response as fast as possible, you could build a very fast, minimal distributed data solution using Bun as the runtime. And that way you could write JavaScript to actually be the thing that fetches from that SQL without taking a performance hit.
Yeah, I think that'd be really cool. Yeah, I think that. So yeah, so like macros I think are going to be a big way people use Bun. That is just a new way to do server side rendering. I think another use case is going to be a lot of CLI tools because it starts so much faster than other tools that exist today. I think that it will be a natural fit for CLIs, and I also think the testing. It needs to be a little bit further along on the testing side, but I think the test runner is going to be really interesting, especially because going back to how Bun has like a transpiler API built in, because I think there will be some, this probably won't be done by Bun, but I think there will be some other testing library built on top of Bun where you could do really fast browser tests. I think there's going to be I think there will be somebody will make a build of Bun that runs an actual web browser, like it builds like Safari or maybe Chrome or both, and embeds the JavaScript parts into that, or has a very good integration with the JavaScript parts, and builds like a testing library that's really fast that runs browsers directly, headless browser. But I think part of the reason why integration tests are pretty slow is because they have to talk over this IPC protocol in order to coordinate with the test runner. So instead, if you put the test runner in the browser and you make it really fast to generate code that the test will run, the browser integration test should be a lot faster.
Very interesting. I hadn't thought of that. What if you had an integration test layer that was the browser and the test integration built into one? Fascinating.
Yeah, I think that, but like the current state of like Bun testing is very early. But the idea essentially right now is to implement most of Jest testing API, because I don't think people in general philosophically, I think JavaScript developers are way too often they're forced to learn a completely new API because the author wanted to make up a new API for fun. I think in general, it's much better to just have an API, to just use an API that already exists, implement an API that already exists. So that way people don't have to learn a new thing, people don't have to change their existing code around. I think there are the counter argument to that is that what if it makes your code slower? Or that's not exactly the right way to phrase that. The right way to phrase that is there are faster ways to do these APIs. And this is something that Bun kind of it's a hard thing to balance. Like the web APIs in general are harder to make fast than doing an API, than designing an API from the beginning to be more with performance in mind.
And what's Deno's excuse?
I do think the JavaScript on the server should feel a lot like JavaScript in the browser. I think Deno's doing great with that. And Bun is also inspired by that to some extent. That's why Bun both tries to implement a lot of web APIs, like WebSocket, for example, while also, but there's just this balance of, I think Bun will end up having like standards-based API for a lot of things, and then a bun-based API that is like faster. An example of that right now, which needs documentation, is that the readable stream. So in one of the benchmarks on the landing page, like the React SSR is a few times faster than other JavaScript runtimes. And a big part of what made that faster is that Bun is using the readable stream type in browsers is either bytes or default, and Bun as a third type. It's called direct. And the idea is that the implementation of the controller, the implementation of the controller is based on the output source. A lot of time is spent when you're writing if you have a generic interface for writing to a thing, to queuing up some data to send to a thing, that's a lot slower in a lot of cases than just writing directly to the thing. And because, for example, you have to deal with conversion, you have to encode it, you have to have like a text encoder running that as a separate thing, and then that text encoder running as a separate thing adds overhead. Bun has this third type, direct, where you're writing directly to the controller, to the output source, and so it doesn't run and it doesn't actually start until you start responding to the request. But what it means is that when you do like new response render to readable stream, like React and then .text, that is running a completely different one of these. The controller object passed to the readable stream is completely different than the controller object passed if you do .array buffer, or if you're just rendering to it for an HTTP request. And that was like a big performance boost. It was like a 1.5x to 2x performance boost to React server-side rendering.
So no more render to string?
No, well, that was like an API change to React DOM already. That render to string still works, but render to string. The important part of this API is that from the user-facing perspective, it's still the same function for React DOM server.browser and React DOM server.bun. So you don't have to make code changes to use this other faster way. This is going to be a PR to Facebook/React. I just haven't had time because Bun blew up. But you can see the code in Bun's repo. And
how do you run that if you can't patch package in Bun yet?
Yeah, that's a problem. For now, you just copy paste the file, which is terrible.
I think that's a free PR idea for anybody in here who wants to make their first open source Zig contribution. Give me my package cool. Patch package words.
That'd be great. In general, Bun needs a built-in diffing thing. It's necessary for the test runner too. That's also why the test runner, I keep saying it's very much a work in progress. It's because if you call expect, if the text doesn't match, it doesn't actually show a diff. It really needs to show a diff. This is like an obvious thing. But last I checked, there was no diffing library in Zig. This needs to be written. And you could use a C library, but it needs to be very careful about how the memory stuff, it needs to be the diffing text is often a source of slowness in software, so it needs to be very performance minded. I also think that would be an interesting runtime API to expose. There's a lot of this stuff. Like in Bun right now, only a very small fraction of the APIs Bun has internally are exposed in the runtime. I expect this to change, and I expect that Bun will have a much larger built-in group of built-in modules. Like another example is it has a whole file system router for NextJS. And it's not really specific to NextJS at all. It just happens to have the same route pattern matching. And that should really be exposed to JavaScript as like a thing you can just run independently without using NextJS. But just as like you want to add file system routing, here's 2 lines of code and you have a whole file system router set up for you. I also think that'll be a good way to make certain types of applications faster, because if you can move the step of what code to run to make it easy, so that way you only run a very small, exactly what the user requests instead of running all of the code, it'll make apps start up faster on the server. That in general, that's why I think like file system routing is very good as a pattern.
Interesting. I'm not as into file system routing, so that's interesting to hear from you in particular. But it makes sense. I can see why it theoretically would be faster, but I barely use page routing in Next right now. One of the bigger pain points I have that's keeping me from adopting Bun is not having API function support, because I have two API functions that serve 98% of my application, and I need to be
Oh,
able to
wow.
have this.
Yeah, this is going to be supported. The first thing that we're working on before that is adding proper support for Express. When that's as part of that work, a lot of the request and response stuff in Node will be implemented.
Yeah, they're pretty one-to-one. And I could even like theoretically take my important pieces of my next API and rewrite them to be Express pretty quick, because that's just these two endpoints, like my TRPC endpoint and my auth endpoint, and I need those to be hittable from server and client.
That makes sense. I think that they're like the other way to approach this, and this as like in theory it could work right now if somebody wanted to submit a PR to Bun Framework Next to write a wrapper around requests and around how like the request and response objects are created. This would be possible before waiting on all this Express work. But the way this really needs like a native integration to support these APIs to do it really well and to do it in a way that's not like hacky, but actually like works in a large percentage of apps without issue. Yeah, API routes really need to be supported. But also in general, other more types of apps need to be supported. Bun needs to fully support like Vue, and it needs to support Angular apps really well. What I want to do there is I want to have a loader API built in. And the really cool thing about a loader API built into a runtime this way is that because Bun can be used for browsers too, to build for browsers, you could have the same loader API for browser bundling and for code that runs on your server. What I'm thinking there specifically is it's probably going to look a lot like ESBuild in terms of the actual plugin API for loaders. And I think that'll be good because ideally, then a bunch of the ESBuild plugins could just work in Bun. There's specific questions there around how do you make it actually load the plugin, and it might be that like the module, the setup process is going to be a little bit different. I think because it needs to be able to load the plugins potentially in parallel. It might load ideally some of these plugins would run on a different thread than the main thread. So it would be running multiple instances of JavaScript, potentially just for running these plugins. But so those details still need to be figured out. But I do think it's very plausible to just have a loader API built in that's very easy to use. And I also think that this whole framework thing is going to be another thing I'm thinking about, is that what if giving really low level hooks for frameworks to configure Bun, both for when using it to run code on the server and running code on the browser, but as an API for these in the way that is in existing tools today. It's always been a hack, instead of you override require, and there are APIs for these things, but it needs to be very easy to configure in as a built-in first class thing.
There's two interesting directions here in terms of what the future of Bun integration is in frameworks, where what you're discussing here, which is making the primitives in a way where others could create adapters for different frameworks. Do you see a future in the other direction where people start building frameworks around Bun and its strengths? If you get that multi-threading, a framework that from the ground up says, hey, we have Bun, we have the ability to multi-thread JavaScript in the back. What can we do with that? And building from the ground up that way.
Yeah, I guess I haven't quite. This is also new to me that people are really using Bun because it's just came out. That I've been coming from the perspective of it needs to work as much as possible with the existing ecosystem because people shouldn't have to rewrite their code. But maybe I should start thinking more about what if we make what new things are possible because of the APIs Bun enables. But I do think that I do think that the specific thing about multi-threading, I have a lot of ideas there. I think this is not what we're going to do right now or soon, but there's a good blog post in JavaScript core about what a potential threading model looks like for the web, where that would be quite a bit, that would let you have shared memory for different threads. There's a problem right now with JavaScript threads where there aren't threads really. When you have a worker, you have to do a post message in order to send data to another worker. But and then you can use shared array buffer, but then you're stuck with this fixed size buffer that you and it's hard to use objects with it, because you either have to write some like binding code that like turns the byte offset into a JavaScript object, or you have to like just use numbers for everything. So like there's a JavaScript core blog post on the WebKit blog about where you actually have a thread object, and you can just like share data between JavaScript and in different threads, similar to native code. And I don't know if we'll do something like that with Bun, but I think that would be a really cool direction. I think that'd be a lot more interesting than just workers. Now, and Bun definitely needs workers, but I think that something like that would be a lot more powerful and a lot faster than what exists today.
Totally agree, and it's a very exciting potential future. So we've touched on like most of the like areas of spicy interest that exist right now, like the framework war and where Bun fits, the runtime war and when Bun fits. I feel like we've touched on deployment, but I haven't really dove in. I'd love to hear a bit more about how you think of Bun's deploy story, what environments you think it'll be ideal in, and how the future of Bun in production looks.
Yeah, I think that Bun is going to have, there's a few things there. One is that I think Bun needs to have a separate build for Edge runtime as a first class part of it, where a smaller feature set is enabled, but and all the code is pre-bundled, and then also a permissioning model. There's probably going to be two different permissioning models for Bun. One, and only in one of them is an implementation detail, but one is going to be something involving like binary dead code elimination, where like many different builds of Bun would exist, where with certain features turned on and off. And then if you're not using a feature, if your app doesn't read from the file system, then instead of explicitly saying that, instead of runtime checks that prohibit file system access, Bun would just not even have the code to read from the file system in the first place, which means that Bun's binary would be smaller, and it means that you don't actually hit it. There's like a performance hit every time you have to check one of these permissions, and it means there wouldn't be a performance hit because it just wouldn't have the code in the first place. And it also means that if there's any bugs in like the feature flag system or whatnot, that prevents that from being a problem in the first place. Like you can't have. It's much harder for there to be bugs in code that does not exist.
Believe me, that's like the big thing we preach here. It's all about making the pipe from your database to your user as short as possible.
Yeah. So I think that'd be really cool in this Edge runtime environment. And then so for actually deploying it, today there isn't a good story yet. I'm hoping we're working on a few things, but we're still figuring. Today, probably the easiest way to deploy Bun is using something like fly.io. But I think longer term Bun will have something built in to help with this. But it's still like a little bit too early.
So what you're saying is Railway's not about to acquire Bun.
Railway would also be a very good option for Bun, both Railway and fly.io.
Makes a lot of sense. I personally am very bought in onto the serverless and edge world, and I'm excited to see Bun in those environments. But with the like runtime and theoretical number of users and requests you could handle with one box, it seems like a pretty good option.
Yeah, I think people will be very happy with how Bun performs in production. I think that and the other thing I think is that, like longer term, what I'd really like to do for that is once like lots of companies are using it in production, I would love for them to send profiling data of their applications to Bun, and then like I or somebody working on Bun would go in and see what the bottlenecks are in their apps and just make it faster. I think that a lot of JavaScript performance stuff is what I expect to happen is that like a lot of what Bun is faster at it right now than other tools is because like I just spent a bunch of time profiling it and figuring out how to make it faster. And that needs to happen. That also needs to happen with large apps that are using Bun. So it would be really helpful, like not really yet, but soon, when people are actually using Bun in production in various scenarios, is to actually just send profiling data to Bun, and then maybe Bun needs like a built-in thing for this. I'm not exactly sure yet, but some tools to help Bun make Bun faster for the actual applications using it.
That's
I don't know.
yeah.
Did that make sense?
I think I followed. We were so many layers of performance and abstraction deep. It's hard to be certain I'm following, but it seems generally your goal is always focus on performance, and what you've learned from this so far is that it doesn't seem like a lot of people do because it's hard, it's not celebrated, and the tools suck.
Okay, I'll rephrase. Basically, I think that the way to make something faster in a lot of cases is to just look at what's making it, what currently is taking time, and then make that number go down. And I've done that in the version through the tools I have in Bun available to me in Bun right now. But once large apps start using Bun, getting that data from them, getting the profiling data, will basically. I think Bun should especially optimize for large apps, but yeah, I think that the other part of this I think will be interesting is how it'll just be as like a single binary that you upload as like part of the deploy process. Like normally you have to install, and with the install part, this is all going to be like integrated. This is not done yet, but the bundling format for Bun right now, Bun has when you do Bun today, that's the command, it's Bun.
Love that.
Which it's also like confusing. Part of me is like, maybe I should change it, but I think because explaining Bun, people are like, do I run the same name twice or type the same name twice? That doesn't produce a JavaScript file. It produces a .bun, and that's like this file with a ton of metadata that makes it really fast to load. It's your entire node modules folder in one file, except stripped to only be the modules that you're actually using across different parts of your app. And this bundles really fast. It also loads really fast. And the reason why is because this metadata makes it really fast. But I think a more advanced version of that sort of will be how the edge runtime works really fast, and it also is easy to deploy because you just deploy this one .bun file and that's it. That's your whole app. Instead of having to and then later potentially the Bun will also have the compile step where you could do that for Docker files and generate. I'm not exactly sure about that part. It's just something that's like thinking about.
Someone in chat said, so it's like a jar, and I wanted to jump on that because not really. It's more like an exe, if anything. It's a fully created executable that you don't need a separate runtime for. It's like a bundled executable runtime and the code that it runs. It's more like the Deno bundler, which not a lot of people have used, so you won't necessarily understand that, but it creates a self-contained executable that you can run. And I hadn't really thought of that in terms of the deployment experience till now. And that's really interesting. So like in a NextJS app where it has to build and send client-side JS, would that still have all of that potential client-side code like in a public directory that has to be fetched? Or would the .bun exe, when the request for those things comes in, pull them out of that metadata?
It would pull it out of the metadata. But that analogy of a jar file, there's two forms of this. Right now, it's just the .bun. It's not the self-contained executable. The .bun file really is like a jar file. That's closer to that.
Oh, so you have to run it with Bun right now, so it's Bun,
yes.
.bun? Ah.
But the caveat also is that this format needs to be updated a little bit more because, again, it goes back to when Bun was really focused on the dev iteration cycle and not as much on production. But that .bun file, what that'll become is that would be the self-contained, effectively it is a jar file because you do need to run Bun with that. Later Bun will have a separate thing for having executables that are independent specifically focused on things like CLIs. So that way people don't have to install Bun in order to use CLIs written with Bun. To answer to go back to your question, yeah, so having all of these, when you would request these assets on the client, you would just serve directly from this .bun file. And it can do that really fast because Normally, when you're reading from a file, normally for that sort of thing, the kind of code you would write is read from the file, then send to the network request. But when you have when you know the position in the file and the length, then you can send it much faster using a different system call, assuming some constraints like if it's HTTP, if it's HTTP only, if it's HTTP and not HTTPS, which you probably is unless you're running Bun directly as without a load balancer in front. But you probably, I think in most cases, people will still run a load balancer in front. So in that case, it can be HTTP only. There's a faster system call for doing that. It's called send file. And Bun already uses this for bun.file. If you do return new response, and then you pass bun.file and you pass it a file path. And that's why it's a lot faster than other JavaScript runtimes to send files, because it uses this faster system call. And so basically that'll work for when bundling too, when serving bundled assets.
Interesting. I will admit I'm mentally rabbit holing down the idea of a single file deploy, of using a bash lambda function to just call ./bun and have that work. And that's a very exciting feature. So I don't think that the self-contained bundle is just valuable for CLI stuff. I see that as a really happy deployment story.
Yeah, I think it'll be really cool. And I also think that, and the other trade, there's also, when you bundle code for the server, not for the client, you have all these trade-offs in a lot of cases where you have to embed, most bundlers will embed the images, other assets like that, as like base64 encoded strings. They usually don't use binary data directly because the constraint is that the bundling format has to be a JavaScript file. But because Bun is a whole runtime and a bundler and all these things, that's not a constraint for Bun. We can just have our own special binary file format for running JavaScript bundles, and we can do it really fast. So because of that, we can have it's not only a single file deploy, but it is a more optimized version of that than the alternative of loading it from like a tar. Like the easy alternative would be to have a tar file and then like sequentially read parts of the tar file back and forth to find the positions, like looking for the data you need. But all of these archive formats have a lot of trade-offs. Like tarballs have that issue of like sequential access is harder. Zip files tend to be slower to extract. They have a header, at least so you can find where parts of a file are, but they tend to just be a little bit slower to extract than tarballs. So then like a way to think about this bundle format is it's like an archive file, but in a format that's designed specifically for serving JavaScript and for making it faster to load JavaScript. Probably the closest equivalent in terms of like web standards today is like web bundles, which I think Chrome supports, but I'm not sure if other browsers do yet. They were previously called signed exchanges, I think, but bundled exchanges, something like that. It's not very well known, I think. The original intent was for like completely offline progressive web apps.
Interesting.
And also for like AMP stuff.
AMP's haunting us still.
Yeah. But I think Bun doesn't implement web bundles, but I think that would also be interesting as like an output format type. But yeah, I think the bundle part as a single file, easy deploy is a good idea.
Yeah.
And it's like a direction that Bun will go in.
Very interesting. Yeah, I had no idea about how much you could gain from just being able to embed a binary and not having to be JS compliant in JS land if you own a layer outside. With all that said, we've been going for a bit now. I don't want to take too much of your 90 hours of work away when you could be closing bugs and replying in Discord and all those other valuable things. I would love to give you the opportunity to, second to last question, are there any common misconceptions you're seeing about Bun that are going around that you want to clear up or are frustrating or otherwise just things you want to comment on?
I don't think so. I think that honestly, it's just really cool how much people want Bun. It feels very good, and I worked really hard on Bun, and it's very just like awesome to see. It's very surreal. I wasn't expecting this at all.
It's clear the message resonated. I'll say I was expecting this. I just from watching for the last year had a feeling that things were going to be big. And yeah, thanks for proving our chaos and Yeah, it's been absolutely awesome watching this journey, and I'm excited for where it's going to go now.
Yeah, I'm really excited too.
So, what can we, the people of the 430 or so that are still here watching and listening, how can we help out? What can we do to help you push Bun as far as it can go?
If you want more tests would be great, but it does not have enough test coverage yet, and that's also why it's so buggy right now. Bun needs more tests, and you can write these tests in JavaScript using Bun's JavaScript test runner. The command is bun WIP test. One bug that really needs to fix right now, that you'll see when you run the test, is there's like a bug with path.normalize that needs to be fixed. But so yeah, a big help would be write some more tests for Bun. And you can do that without needing to know Zig or without even having to build Bun, because you can just go to the folder and run the test. It's a little more complicated because you have to install the dependencies and things like that. But that's just like Bun install. It's pretty fast. You'll also probably be surprised by that, like the tests run pretty quick because the test runner itself is quick. But it also runs the GC very aggressively. Like it's weird that if you look at the code, you'll see it calls GC almost after every line, because a lot of the things because Bun needs to be really careful about how garbage collection happens with the native code. So that code needs to very aggressively run the garbage collector to make sure that it catches bugs.
In tests, it's basically just constantly running GC to make sure GC's working as expected.
Yeah, that's not how I expect. Other people using Bun tests for like their projects definitely don't need to do that at all. That's like a very specific to how Bun uses it.
Do you think there would be value in separate tests that are just a bunch of as many as you can have edge cases for the GC, or even wrapping all of Bun's tests with a like code mod that splices in a GC call between literally every line?
I think probably the latter is a good long-term solution to this. It's just a hack right now that I just add GC to like every line. But it also makes it really clear what's happening. It's a similar trade-off with what I was talking about earlier with Zig, about how like hidden behavior or hidden control flow and RAII. But yeah, it should just be a hidden thing, I think, that happens automatically because it looks weird.
That makes a ton of sense. Somebody in YouTube chat said that you're always 5 thoughts ahead of what you're saying, in a way where it's I ask a question, you have an answer, you start answering it, but by the end of the sentence, you're already seeing like the work to be done. You're just so in that push hard and make things better mindset. It makes a lot of sense after this talk how you find the 90 hours, because this is just always what's on your mind. And yeah, this has been an awesome chat, from everything from like the history of how you went from Next apps for game dev to the whole like everything that is Bun, to the future that you're seeing with it, the way that you see it being run and built around, and all these other things. There are a few people in chat asking, what can we do to support you specifically, rather than just Bun? How can we support you in your endeavors? Is there a GitHub sponsor link at least?
That there isn't yet. I could make one.
You should do that for a start.
Yeah, maybe I should. Yeah. I don't really need it. Like I'm okay. Like I'm not gonna run out of money, but I do appreciate it. So maybe I will make a GitHub sponsors.
I just saw you made the official Bun, what's it called? Org oven.
Yeah.
Clever.
Yeah. Maybe in the future you'll deploy to the oven.
I could see that working. Very interesting. Good stuff. I super, super appreciate all the time you've taken to chat with us. This has been an awesome peep into the chaos that you've been working on for how long now? When was the first Bun commit?
It's like April of last year, I think.
Damn. That's not too bad a turnaround then. That's a year, 2 months, give or take.
Yeah.
That's insane. Again, thank you so much. No factories, only bakeries. Great having you here.
Thanks for having me.
Peace, man.
See ya.